Thank you for joining us for the RCVRC's 2019 Symposium, Building a Solid Foundation. My name is Chris Hughes, and I am the Policy Director for the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. I will be your moderator for this session, titled RCV by the Numbers. A few housekeeping matters are needed before we get started. Participants have been muted for this webinar to reduce audio interference since we have a large number of attendees. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizer so we may try to assist. If you have a question or comment regarding this session, please type that message in the question box. Session 5 will be about 30 minutes, followed by a brief question and answer period. Questions we are unable to address during this live session will be answered in a follow-up document, which we will email to attendees and also post with a recording of this session on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website within a couple of weeks of the symposium. For those that are not familiar with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, we provide a compilation of best practices and first-hand experiences from jurisdictions that have used this method of voting, with a focus on election administration, since that is our background. The website, www.rankedchoicevoting.org, and our other resources have been developed as educational tools for election administrators, policymakers, voters, candidates, and others. The Resource Center continues to evolve, as does ranked choice voting. Both are building a solid foundation, and we hope these resources and sessions help you and others improve our democracy and the conduct of elections. We have one presenter for this session, Erica Frazier. Erica specializes in research and data analysis. Before coming to FairVote, where she works as a data analyst, she worked extensively in education and political discourse analysis. Frazier graduated with a bachelor's degree in history and communications from the University of Arkansas in 2009. From 2009 to 2011, she served as a Teach for America Corps member in New Orleans. She has a master's degree from the University of Orleans in France and recently completed a joint dissertation in international politics/foreign languages, cultures and literatures at Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland and the University of Orleans. Please welcome Erica as she takes us on a deep dive into the numbers on RCV. I will send screen control over to her now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the good intro, Chris. I'm Erica Frazier, as Chris said, and I work here as the research manager at FairVote. And in my position, I've gotten to see a lot of really interesting, compelling data, and I wanted to share that with the attendees here at the symposium today. So we're going to go through RCV by the numbers, and I've compiled quite a few statistics, and some of my slides are a bit text heavy, unfortunately, but I wanted to make sure that the information came through even if there were some problems with audio. So if you have any questions, I've spoken with Chris and the other organizers of the symposium. Please feel free to send those questions in as we go. And if I need to stop and address any of those, they'll be forwarded directly to me. So to start off, we're going to look at the order of the presentation. I'm going to talk about some polls of user experience with RCV, the use of rankings within the ranked choice voting systems, and then we'll talk about exhausted ballot rates, general voter understanding of RCV, any irregular ballot error rates that we've seen, outcomes of different elections, turnout, and then election administrators' takes on the system. So to start off, we'll look at some of the polling data, the most recent polling data that we've been able to obtain from exit polls. Santa Fe very recently used RCV for the first time in their municipal elections, and overall, we would say that it was a very successful first implementation. 81% of voters were very satisfied with their first experience using RCV, and 71% expressed support for using it in future elections. So it's not only a majority of voters, but it's an overwhelming majority of voters on both of those metrics. If we were to see this kind of agreement across the board for RCV, we would be quite pleased. The third statistic that I'd like to share with you on the exit polls from 2018 in Santa Fe would be more of the voters' experience of the election up to election day. So not just the use of the system, but the way in which candidates engage with the system. So more than 2/3 of voters, or about 2/3 of voters, felt that the tone of the campaigns was more positive than previous mayoral races. So we're not only impacting voters' experience on election day, but also the days leading up to them casting those ballots. We can also look at Maine's recent experience with RCV. So while the city of Santa Fe used it for their municipal races, the state of Maine was able to use it for federal offices as well. So in Maine, again, positive numbers across the three questions that I'm presenting here, being the most pertinent, I would say, to our discussion with the RCV-RC symposium. 74% found that it was easy to use. 61% wanted to either maintain the use of ranked choice voting for federal offices or even expand it to other offices in the state. And the final point that I wanted to highlight here is that 62% of voters polled thought that it was important to have a majority outcome. Maine had had a history of split plurality wins, people being elected with quite low shares of the vote, much less than 50%. So this is an interesting case highlighting the perceived benefits or the actual benefits of implementing ranked choice voting versus a standard first past the post plurality system. Polls from the year before from Minnesota were also very favorable. So you can see in the first question here, 92% of respondents found that ranked choice voting was simple. For the next question, I wanted to pull out some of the differences here. So 66% of respondents, not just people who voted in the election, but all respondents, stated that they wanted to continue using RCV. The disagree total was actually less than people who were undecided. So had those undecideds come down on the side of RCV, or continued to be undecided there, it's still a substantial number of people who are in favor of continuing the use of RCV. It's not a binary response there. So the people who haven't decided that they are in favor of RC are not necessarily opposed to it either. So I wanted to highlight kind of the nuances in the responses to that question. For St. Paul, I have a bit less detailed data, but I do have favorable statistics as well, highlighting that RCV is perceived as simple and that people would like to continue using it. So 83% thought the system is simple to use, and 72% would like to continue using it. So again, favorable polling data from cities and states across the country, from Minnesota to Maine to New Mexico. And we're hoping to add to this data stash with more polling in the future. We're moving on to discussions of the use of rankings. So if you look at this data from the Bay Area as well as Minneapolis, you can see that large numbers of voters are choosing to use the opportunity to rank their preferences. This data was collected from the ballots that have been released, or the records of the votes that have been released by the different clerks involved. So the county, in San Francisco's case, Alameda County in the case of the 3 other Bay Area cities, and then Minneapolis's data was also released. So you can see that well over 70% in Berkeley, and then closer to 70% in Oakland, San Leandro, and San Francisco, and then just under 70% in Minneapolis chose to rank their candidates in races that featured 3 or more candidates. If we talk about the issue of exhausted ballots, this ties directly into the issue of using the opportunity to rank. So some ballots are artificially limited in their expression because the machines that count the ballots can only allow for so many rankings. And as we've seen in the previous slide, people do tend to rank as many candidates as they're allowed to, at least 2, if not more. In the case of Santa Fe's mayoral contest featuring 5 candidates, very few ballots were actually exhausted because people did choose to use the opportunity to rank. So 96% of ballots saw their choices being expressed in the last round of counting. If you look at Maine's gubernatorial primary for the Democratic Party, as well as the 2nd Congressional District's ballots, you can see, again, over 90%, so 93% in the Democratic gubernatorial primary. And in the case of the 2nd Congressional District, 97% of those ballots were still active in the final round of counting. So although there are some concerns, especially among people who question the implementation of RCV for whatever reason, although there are some concerns about exhausted ballot rates, from what we've seen in recent experiences where voters were allowed to rank their candidates, we've seen that ballot exhaustion really isn't an issue to be feared. People like ranking their candidates and using that opportunity, thus preventing their ballots from being exhausted. If we move on to some very exciting newly released studies, this actually came out last week, I believe. It was published online. It was a study by Donovan, Tolbert, and Gracie, and they wanted to measure different voters' understanding of the use of RCV. The bottom line that they came up with, I think, is probably the most helpful takeaway from this preliminary research on the use of ranked choice voting. It's a growing field. Although we do have data available, people or researchers still need to conduct more analyses, do more testing. The more data that we have available, the more we can really suss out what needs to be done to implement ranked choice voting effectively. And this study that just came out, as I said, ended up showing that ranked choice voting doesn't have a disproportionate impact on communities of color, for example, which was one concern that has been raised in the past about ranked choice voting. It does, however, the study shows that voter education is absolutely critical to successful implementation of RCV, just as it would be to any electoral system in general, as many of you would know. Older voters do tend to report less understanding. And again, this could be combated with education, but it might also come down to the fact that we have taken this current voting system for granted for so long that switching to something new can be a bit disconcerting. So again, that's where education would come in. An interesting finding as well is that Asians and women reported less understanding of elections in general, not just RCV, and that education correlated with greater reported understanding. So again, we're tending to see that well-educated white men feel more comfortable or report greater understanding of RCV. Now again, this study actually focuses on self-reports. So the respondents gauged their own understanding, which means that if you have a respondent who tends to feel more confident, they may report more confidence with this new voting system. So it might also be an impact of gender in terms of self-reported understanding rather than actual understanding. So that's something that would be interesting to follow up on and do some more research on. At any rate, I've included some of the tables so attendees can kind of look through the data themselves. But what I found most interesting is that it was a large study, and overall, those who reported finding it very easy or somewhat easy far outweighs the number of people who found it somewhat difficult or very difficult. So I think in terms of this particular table, it does highlight the fact that if voting instructions are presented to voters, then they feel empowered and confident that they understand RCV. It's broken down in this slide by race and ethnicity. And again, we do tend to see very little difference between white and non-white respondents in terms of perceptions of whether RCV is easy, in terms of somewhat easy or very easy to understand. Another slide. This time, rather than any voting system, this slide is focusing on two of the most prevalent ones in the United States at the moment. So winner take all or top two. And again, I find this quite interesting in terms of who feels that they understand these two most prevalent systems very well or extremely well versus the plurality or RCV systems. You do see a drop-off in terms of understanding for plurality winners who feel that they understand the system extremely well versus even RCV. So again, an interesting study that highlights that, that ranked choice voting, if voters are empowered with detailed instructions, ranked choice voting is something that is easy to understand and to be understood quite well. If we move on into how this translates into not just the use of ballots in terms of rankings, but those irregular ballots or ballot error rates, which is a concern for any voting system. Again, we find some interesting data. This is a chart reflecting the overvote rates in contested races. So we eliminated those votes or those ballots, that didn't express a vote. So undervotes were not included in these totals. So that way we could really see of those who participated, how many were casting overvotes, or how many were casting overvotes that rendered their ballot invalid. So there are some jurisdictions in which casting an overvote does not necessarily render the ballot invalid if there is a clear expression of a preference later on in the ballot. That is to say, if, for example, for the first ranking, the ballot includes 2 candidates, and for the second ranking, they include just 1, some of the jurisdictions will take that second ranking, the one with just 1 candidate expressed, they will just skip the overvote error and give that ballot's vote to the second ranked preference. So in terms of those cities that do not do this, that count a ballot as invalid the first time there's an overvote, or an overvote in the first round renders the ballot invalid. So that would be cities in the Bay Area, the 2nd Congressional District in Maine, and as sort of a throwback, Pierce County, Washington. You can see these ballot error rates. And looking at the ballot error rates, any ballot that's not effectively cast is kind of a shame, but it's not going to show, or at least in terms of the data that we have right now, we're not seeing impacts in which RCV is shown to be responsible for causing more irregular ballots or overvote errors. So we have side-by-side comparisons of the same ballot in which some RCV races were also run at the same time as top 2 races. And you can see that the ballot error rates, or the overvote rates, in these elections are either comparable for RCV or actually far, far reduced. A lot of this difference comes down to ballot design. Excuse me. So these are thank you. Chris just sent me a question asking to clarify those ballot error rates. And this is a decimal. I realize it's kind of difficult to see. So it's 0.21%. So far less than 1% of the ballots are rendered invalid due to overvotes. So if we return to this, we can see that nearly 2% of ballots under this top 2 were rendered invalid due to overvotes versus 0.18. So there's a significant difference between the 2 systems. And again, that comes down to ballot design. So if you were to pull up the sample ballots for the San Francisco races highlighted here, the ballot error rate could likely be attributed to a very difficult ballot design, at least from the voter's perspective. So sometimes they continue on to multiple pages, they're laid out in a way that isn't necessarily intuitive, these kinds of issues. So again, most of the error rates that we're seeing, if compared side by side, show that ranked choice voting has no impact or no negative impact on overvote averages. So let's see. I think this is probably, in terms of the symposium scope, this is slightly outside, but I think it's important to kind of broaden our outlook a little and talk about the actual outcomes of the elections. So we've mostly been focusing on voter experience with the ballot or the process, but it's also interesting to think of the wider impact that ranked choice voting could potentially have on the candidates that we elect. So if we look at changes over time, in terms of the candidates who are being elected. We can see that more candidates of color have won election in Bay Area cities and Minneapolis following the implementation of RCV. Some of these elections have actually been thanks to what we call comeback wins or come from behind wins. So in some RCV elections, you will see that a candidate, the winning candidate, actually wasn't the leading candidate in the first round of counting. But thanks to vote transfers and multiple rounds of counting, they ended up being selected as the representative for this jurisdiction. The best example, or one of the most compelling examples that I've found in my research here at FairVote, is a story from an election in Minneapolis in 2017. There was a majority-minority ward who had been represented by a white woman incumbent named Barb Johnson for quite a long time. And Philippe Cunningham, a challenger and a transgender man who was African American, ended up being elected in 2017 instead. The reason I find this story so compelling is that Cunningham was boosted by those third place transfer votes from Stephanie Gaska, who is also a woman of color. So this is where you can see ranked choice voting in action. There we go. So this is called a Sankey diagram, and it helps you follow the transfer of votes. You can see the first round of counting on the left, in which 5,263 valid ballots were cast. And you can see how in the second round of counting, candidates were eliminated and their votes were transferred to the top two contestants. So you have Barbara Johnson, the incumbent, and Philippe Cunningham, the challenger or the leading challenger, and you can see how those vote totals actually came down to the wire. But thanks to transfers from another candidate, another challenger, Stephanie Gaska, those votes ended up being reallocated to help Philippe Cunningham come from behind to win the election. So again, this is an example that I found interesting because it shows the ways in which voters can engage with the system and see a candidate who they would perceive as more representative actually being elected. So rather than having that plurality outcome in which the incumbent is once again elected, people are able to express their preferences in a way that help them elect their most preferred candidate. If we look at these outcomes across the board, rather than just zooming in on this one example, you can see that representation for people of color in these communities has increased quite significantly in some cases, especially the cases of San Leandro and San Francisco there in the middle. So San Leandro is a city that very recently began electing candidates of color, whereas they had had a mostly, if not exclusively, board or a city council composed of white representatives. And this was out of step with the residents of the town's ethnicities and backgrounds. So we're seeing RCV have real world impacts in terms of allowing communities of color, minority groups, express their preferences for candidates who are more reflective of themselves. So in terms of improving descriptive representation, you can see some real world impacts via RCV as a system. So I think the most compelling longitudinal or over time example would be the San Francisco mayor and board of supervisors. So I did go ahead and nerd out here and put my R squared, and you can see that there is a significant correlation in or over time, there is a strong trend of improved representation of minorities on the Board of Supervisors and mayoral positions in San Francisco. I'm starting to run over time a bit, so I'll go ahead and get on here with my last points for this issue of election outcomes. So I think more than anything, the trends that I've shown or the compelling stories of vote transfers among minority communities, I think those facts tend to highlight that we need more data. So we have lots of questions to ask, and these questions should be explored in more detail by interested scholars. Even activists have a place in shaping the stories that we tell about RCV. So asking those compelling questions and highlighting the different backgrounds of candidates and whether or not more candidates are encouraged to run, perhaps because of the new system, if changing demographics in the cities have been playing a role in who actually nominates candidates or which candidates have a chance of being successful. If we look at the way that RCV has impacted incumbents' re-election, we're seeing less of an impact. Most are seeing results on par or very similar to what re-election rates were before the implementation of RCV. So in Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco, and San Leandro, you're seeing rates of 80% or more. Again, incumbents still enjoy a very similar advantage of the name recognition, of records, voting on issues that matter to the city. There's a very similar rate of re-election in the Twin Cities. So St. Paul and Minneapolis both use ranked choice voting, and you can see that their re-election rates are actually pretty comparable. I wanted to highlight, however, that the Minneapolis re-election rate saw kind of a weird blip. It was almost like the blue wave that we saw in 2018's midterm elections, in that there was a wave of challenger success. So in 2017, a pretty remarkable number of challengers ended up being elected at a rate that hadn't really been seen before in the RCV system. So I pulled that kind of blip year out and separated it so you can see 2009 through 2017 as a whole versus that 2017 year being isolated and pulled out. So again, I think this highlights the fact that we could do more research here to figure out what was going on in Minneapolis in 2017 to allow so many challengers to be elected. We have similar data from Cambridge, which uses multi-winner RCV. We're seeing re-election rates that are quite comparable with other cities across Massachusetts, including Worcester, Lowell, Boston, and Medford. If we look at turnout, turnout seems to be kind of a mixed bag here. We're getting kind of ambivalent messages about turnout under RCV, and that it doesn't appear to make much of a change. Some people will claim that RCV might be too complicated, that it might discourage turnout, but we haven't really seen that. We do know that RCV can dramatically reduce drops in turnout from one round to another if you have a runoff election. And if people are concerned that RCV might be too complicated, again, that's where we can start talking about voter education efforts. So finally, I do know my audience here, so I'd be interested in kind of pulling out some of the stories about election administrators' experiences with RCV. I relied on some really good interviews collected by the RCVRC through their podcast and webinar series. And what I found among the different administrators interviewed is that voters tend to like RCV. And that while switching to RCV represents a significant change and will take a lot of work, the same best practices tend to apply. So being transparent with voters and candidates and anyone else who's involved, all stakeholders need to know about the voting system, the counting process, and they need to be kept informed. I've also gathered that being competent and projecting that competence and confidence has been increasingly important for election administrators, and this is no different under RCV. And finally, educating the voters is something that they've all talked about as well. So if we look at the Alameda County Registrar of Voters interview on RCV Clips, he made it pretty clear that although there was a lot of initial investment and setup when initially switching to RCV, this front loading and initial investment has paid off in that elections now are easier to administer and each one gets easier. He also saw that ballots tended to be correctly marked and that voter error wasn't really an issue from his perspective. Casey Carl, who did present yesterday as well, he had a lot of positive feedback on the change to RCV. So he talked about the positive polling data and the fact that these positive perspectives or these positive reactions to RCV continue to improve over time, that more people are finding the system easy to use and that they choose to use the opportunity to rank their ballots. Matt Dunlap, who recently participated in an RCVRC webinar and was the Secretary of State, or is the Secretary of State for Maine, he seemed to think that a lot of people use the opportunity to rank and they really liked being able to use that opportunity. So he's optimistic that this one experience with ranked choice voting was already positive and will only continue to improve. Finally, I wanted to highlight some new research that's supposed to be coming out very shortly from David Kimball at the University of Missouri St. Louis and his graduate student Joseph Anthony, along with Amy Fried and Robert Glover, both at the University of Maine. They actually sent out surveys to election administrators throughout the state to ask them about their thoughts on ranked choice voting and the implementation of the new system. So that's something that I'm looking forward to, and it's going to be presented at the ESRA conference this summer. I think those were the main points that I wanted to hit in my discussion today, and I do have the different sources that I've referenced throughout the presentation available here at the end of my slides. I will also make the presentation available to the RCVRC, and I'm happy to share my contact information if anyone else has any further questions just for me, or we can use the remaining 20 minutes or so to answer any additional questions you might have. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I've enjoyed getting to present to you today.
Thanks so much, Erica. That was really interesting. I'm glad we got to cover so much ground and really get into the numbers of ranked choice voting. So we did get one question actually about the name of that Donovan, Trey, Tolbert, and Gracie paper. So do you mind pulling that one up just for a few seconds so
Absolutely.
so many people can copy that one down?
Let me see if I can, excuse me.
Sure. And
there we are. This is publicly available. It's open access, so anyone who wants to access this file can easily do so.
All right. And we got another question about it was an earlier slide. I think it was the New Mexico, the Santa Fe election. If you know the voter turnout for that election that the exit poll was done in.
Oh goodness. I want to say that the turnout was stronger than anticipated. But I don't have the turnout numbers for that particular election.
Okay. I think it's in a FairVote report. I think I pulled it up while you were presenting. Yeah, so this says the turnout there in 2018 was 38%, which, and compared to previous elections in Santa Fe, so the 2014 election was 29%, 2010 was 27, 2006 was 30%. So, spitballing about 8 percentage points higher than a typical mayoral election in Santa Fe.
Which it is helpful to highlight that they do take place over the summer. They're not linked to.
Right, they're a March election, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they are kind of, they're not at the best time of year for turnout. So it does look like turnout was higher with this election. It might also be not necessarily thanks to ranked choice voting, but thanks to greater publicity that an election was taking place due to the switch in systems.
Right. Well, in Santa Fe as well, it's worth remembering that that was their first time actually electing a mayor. They had not previously elected the mayor by the people of the city. It had been I think, an appointed position from the city council.
That's a very good point.
We've got one more question, or I've got a couple more, but one about the R squared value you showed on that the candidates of color being elected. So the question is, in one slide you showed an R squared value. Is this indicating that the adoption of ranked choice in that community explained that value of the variance in the elected candidates of color, all else equal?
I would be very hesitant to link them as directly as that. So we have seen demographic shifts in the Bay Area. And I think some of this might correlate with those demographic shifts as well. So as certain communities' populations change, they may be able to elect their preferred candidate of choice more easily, just thanks to less vote splitting, etc. So, or even perhaps in group vote transfers. So I would be very reluctant to say that this improvement has been directly due to RCV. I do think it's something that can be controlled for and should be explored in more detail by scholars not necessarily affiliated with FairVote. I would like for this to be subjected to rigorous academic analysis, which controls for multiple variables. And I don't want it to seem as though advocates for ranked choice voting are massaging the numbers. So this is the kind of data that seems promising and I think can easily present a great opportunity for further research.
Great. So we have a comment, not a question, but someone mentioned when we were talking about irregular ballots that when the margin of victory or the margin of error is larger than the margin of victory, then you've got a problem if you have more ballots not counting than the number of ballots separating the winners, which I think is a very valid point to make in that sort of context. Do you know what the margins were in the races you were looking at? Because was that median ballot error on the RCV races and specific ballot error for
It
the
was across
governor and Senate
multiple.
races?
It was across multiple elections. So most of these.
I think you scrolled too far.
You're right.
Slide 14.
Thank you. So if you look at this, these are compiled across years and across many, many offices. So I think if we were to zoom in on specific races, I think we could start kind of teasing that out. And I think that's a good avenue for future research, actually. So thank you for the suggestion there, for future projects.
Always. Do we have another question? Are there any studies on how RCV can help or hurt third-party candidates?
So I think Maine is a helpful case study, but I haven't seen a systematic study for that. Part of this is due to the fact that a lot of RCV races that have taken place at the municipal level, which is the most prevalent use of RCV in the United States at the moment, most of those races are unaffiliated. So because they're nonpartisan races, we're not really seeing that third party impact. However, if we look at the state of Maine's most recent use of RCV for federal offices, we did see third-party candidates running, and although they were eliminated, you didn't have that nasty bashing of spoilers or wasted votes or throwing your vote away for these third-party candidates. So in terms of third-party success, I've yet to see very much data on that. But in terms of more positive discussions of the races, I would say that Maine would probably be the place to look. But again, it is a pretty new system for Maine. So I think we'll need to kind of wait and see what kinds of data we can collect over time before we can really weigh in on the way that this impacts third-party candidates.
Right. Yeah, we have the theory that ranked choice voting can help at least reduce the spoiler effect and so make third-party candidates less vilified, but we're not sure about its real impact yet in the real world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I have a question about the methodology for the Donovan Tolbert Gracie study you were talking about. I was wondering, well, I guess I have two questions. One, were they taking the exact instructions from RCV ballots in those cities that they were polling and put them in front of voters to say, do you understand this? Do you not understand this? Or was it based on voter recollection of the voting instructions?
I think voters or the participants in this study were given ballot instructions. I'm not clear, though, on exactly where they obtained those instructions or what they used as a model. That's something that I'll need to read in more detail, I think. But luckily, this is publicly available for free.
Right. Well, and so I was wondering, at a deeper level, if they were looking at the grade level for those written instructions for ranked choice voting versus plurality, because there are those systems where you can plug in written language and get a grade level returned to you anywhere from kindergarten to somewhere in grad school.
Right. So I'm
I'd be
not
interested
sure,
for that sort of thing too.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they tested the Lexile scores for the participants, and I'm not sure exactly if anyone has actually looked at that in great detail in a systematic comparison of the different voting systems. So I'm sure that there are plenty of studies in terms of like crafting and creating good ballot instructions, but I'm not sure that they've looked at the impact of that on RCV.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's what I was wondering about, because I think I mentioned this in every possible Q&A I can, but the Resource Center worked with the Center for Civic Design on ballot design, but also ballot instructions on, how to create a set of ballot instructions with visuals and written text that most voters found like easy to follow. So I'm curious how they built that for this study, and if there's some sort of inherent complication because you need a few more instructions for ranked choice voting. That's unavoidable. Or it's best practices to have a bit more information than plurality where you say select a candidate. So I'm curious if you can still write that sort of language in a way that's approachable and maybe wouldn't make people feel like it's very difficult or somewhat difficult, or at least at lower rates than they did in this study.
Right.
Well, I'm not seeing any other questions come in, but we do actually have one more. RCV has been used in nonpartisan elections, but seems to have great promise for primaries within political parties. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
I guess I should express agreement, actually. It seems that there are a few primaries and even the Iowa caucus. They're looking at using ranked choice voting, or they actually are going to be using ranked choice voting for the Democratic nomination process. So it seems that within the party, especially when you have such a wide field, this could be a way to kind of consolidate vote shares and to dispel some of the negativity. So opening up that Pandora's box of the 2016 election, there were really only two candidates within the Democratic Party. So that isn't necessarily as interesting as the Republican side of things. The FairVote conducted an online poll with YouGov and the University of William and Mary. There were 16 Republican candidates at the time that we conducted the process, and the field was winnowing down by a few candidates as the study continued. But we saw a lot of participants wanting to rank all of the candidates, all 16 of them, expressing their preferences. And having those transfers, I think, was a way to see who the most viable candidates were and how they could consolidate votes behind a leading candidate. So I think if we see this applied in the Democratic primaries this year, we'll see the kinds of potential that it could have in terms of making people feel confident in the candidate selected. Because RCV is a system that helps you get at that majority candidate, I think that voters in those Democratic primaries should be able to feel more confident that they're nominating the best candidate that they can, or the candidate that is most representative of the party. Because again, when you have such a wide field, it's very difficult to really point to any one person and say they're the representative. Regardless of polling data, there still are large gaps, I guess, in support among the different candidates. So I agree with the question or the comment there that we haven't seen it implemented in a meaningful way in the primaries before now. So it's going to be a very exciting process to watch, just in, from a political geek's perspective of seeing this play out in real life, but also from an advocate's perspective, in that this will be a much better way of narrowing the field and nominating the person that the Democratic Party can really support. I think, I don't know, it's an exciting time to be working in this field.
Absolutely. I mean, it was interesting yesterday during the legislation panel, Wendy Underhill from NCSL mentioned that, uh, you know, 7 or so years ago, she would get questions, or she would hear nothing from RCV, or nothing about ranked choice voting, or if she did hear about it, it was, what is this thing that people are talking about? Mm-hmm. And now with Maine and with Santa Fe and sort of ranked choice voting breaking on to the a more mainstream scene, she's getting questions just, I've heard about this RCV thing. What can you tell me more about it? I'd like to learn where it's being used and why and that sort of thing, instead of just what is this thing at all.
Yeah.
I've got one more comment, but I'm curious to sort of draw out an explanation from you about the Sankey diagram you used
Oh,
in
yeah.
the Minneapolis example. So what you mentioned that Sankeys are good because you can sort of follow where votes went to and came from. Were there any other reasons for choosing it, or how do you choose what sort of visualization you want to use for ranked
Right.
choice voting?
Um, I've also seen bar graphs used for ranked choice voting to express vote transfers. So if I were to switch to this, maybe this isn't the greatest graph to use, but sometimes you'll see, for example, people will take these two bar graphs and then you'll see the blue stacked on top of the purple to represent vote transfers, so on and so forth. I chose to do the Sankey diagram because it can kind of show you that round by round process as well as the process overall. So you were able to see the number of votes that were stacking up in favor of each candidate from the very beginning of the process, partway through the process, and then the final round all at once. I also liked that you can trace those little sinuous lines from one candidate to another. So while I talked a lot about the vote transfers that Philippe Cunningham was able to pick up from Stephanie Goska's supporters, you also see that some of Stephanie Goska's supporters did support the incumbent Barb Johnson. So I think it's interesting in that this diagram helps you tease out the fact that we can't ever talk about monolithic voting blocks. There are nuances in opinions and support, and there are differences among the different supporters. So I chose this diagram to highlight that as much as anything else. It shows that kind of wider process of vote transfers, and it shows the fact that there are differences even within those candidates that were eliminated, even within their support groups. So I think the Sankey diagram is also neat because it's new. It was my first time making one, so I thought it would be kind of cool to give it a try. The city of Minneapolis, if you were to go to their elections website, they did this for their most recent mayoral election, and you can see the way that Jacob Frey's vote tallies changed over time to eventually win him the office. So I think it's kind of neat, and it's one of the ways that people have been pioneering and expressing vote transfers for ranked choice voting. So I think that there are a lot of interesting ways that you can visualize the process of transferring votes, and I think that this is one among many, and I'm trying to kind of try a few different methods to see what really resonates and sticks.
Absolutely. Well, and that's a perfect segue into the end. So our final presentation, session 6, is this afternoon at 6 Eastern Time, called So Who Won? Software for Tabulating and Displaying Results for RCV. So you'll get to hear people talk a bit more then, both about tabulating the results of a ranked choice voting election, the software available, and how to display those results, including using Sankey diagrams, which we'll hear a bit about from JP Heisel from the city of Minneapolis during that session. But thanks again, Erica, for this really fascinating presentation, and thanks to our attendees for joining us for session 5 of the symposium. We'll work after the symposium with Erica to provide answers to Eastern. I just said, sorry, Rosemary messaged me saying I said the session is at 6 Eastern Time. It's at 3 Eastern Time. It's the 6th session at 3 Eastern. Hopefully nobody got confused from my announcement. But getting back to it, we will work after the symposium to get answers to any questions that we didn't get to today, or any questions that get submitted after this session, and we'll provide that document on our website along with the recording of this session on rankedchoicevoting.org. And one more time. It's session 6 at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And talk to you then. Thanks.
Thank you.